Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Cristina Soriano of Villanova University. Dr. Soriano got her BA in anthropology from the Universidad Central de Venezuela in 1999. She then went to New York University where she got an MA and PhD in 2011. She has published numerous articles and more recently her book, Tides of Revolution, Information Insurgencies and the Crisis of Colonial Rule in Venezuela, published by University of New Mexico Press. She taught history at the Universidad Central de Venezuela for a few years before leaving Venezuela in 2011 when she was appointed as a history professor at Villanova. She is happy to report that she very much enjoyed the 2 national championships that Villanova won since she's arrived there, and I think she's taking some credit for that success. But we're delighted to have her here, and let's join me in giving her a round of applause.
See if I can, okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is my first time in Utah, and it's just beautiful but cold. I'm from Venezuela. And so thank you, the Kennedy Center, for having me. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for the Latin American Studies program and his director, Dr. Xiaomei, to have me, and to BYU, I think is great. I'm happy to be here. So this is a paper I'm giving today, this talk, is pretty much inspired on my book. And it started with a kind of a very simple question, but it was not a simple, I couldn't find a simple answer for it. But it was pretty much like how I needed to understand how Venezuela, being such a crucial place for independence in Latin America, there was not a printing press. So that kind of a common connection that we make between, printing presses and political communities emerging out of this, importance that the press had for the communication and spreading of ideas, that doesn't come as an easy situation in Venezuela. So that was like my original question, and then it got more complicated as I get into the document. So today we'll talk a little bit about that. So in December 1789, the judges of the Audiencia of Caracas, as a court in Caracas, capital of the Captains General of Venezuela, met to discuss a black code that just arrived from Spain in 1789. This was a royal decree that sought to regulate and control the treatment that Spanish masters were giving to their slaves. In the opinion of the court, the masters in Venezuela treated their slaves pretty well. Indeed, the slaves' condition could hardly be improved, they say. Certainly, there were some slaves who were rising up and showing some disobedience in different towns, but in general, they were in good shape. And perhaps the reason why these slaves were rising up is because they were not being properly disciplined. In such case, they said, the black code was not the best solution because, the Audiencia reasoned, improving the lives of the slaves will give them greater hope for freedom and incite them to rebellion. The overwhelming rejection of the black code in Caracas revealed their resistance to altering the social order or even to question the authorities that whites should have in the region. The Audiencia ultimately decided to apply the royal decree, but, I quote, without any hurry or making use of measures capable of slowly calming down the spirits. 6 months later, in June 1790, it became evident that these spirits were not cooled, as 4 incendiary pasquinades were found affixed into the walls of the Central Square Plaza in Caracas. The 4 papers all bore the same message, written in a clumsy handwriting: "O sorrows, O cries, O death. We announce to the public that we are summoned at the royal decree that has come to our majesty in favor of us, the slaves. This decree will be published more by force than by the willingness of the whites and the royal Audiencia, which has not indicated day or hour, to the disgrace of all the white men and women in this city, May 8, 1790. These papers also contain an illustration of a black man with a machete in his right hand and a white man's head dripping blood in his left. By the time the officials found these papers, there were already circles of people commenting on them in public. Horrified by the anonymous threat to the social order, officials debated about the authorship of these broadsides and wondered if they were written by blacks or maybe by, I quote, idle and evil white people insisting in provoking a black uprising and sowing mistrust where none should exist. Officials never managed to identify the author or authors or people who put these papers in public. These broadsides did not merely reflect the tensions between social-racial groups and growing awareness about Atlantic abolitionism. They also serve as an important instrument for communication. Pasquinades or papers such as these sought to overcome the mnemonic limitations of an oral culture and to circumvent the restrictions of a literary world largely controlled by the white elite and the state. These papers then became a medium comprehensible to all, especially to the large population of color living in Caracas. Approximately 60% of the population were people of color. A population that participated in semi-literate networks of communication. In a society with no printing press, these papers acquired particular relevance. It's not moving. Okay. Without significant mine centers and with the scarce and dispersed but resilient indigenous population, Venezuela was never at the core of the initial colonial efforts of Spain. For decades, the province was considered rather peripheral with little economic importance. Largely marginal to the economic and geopolitical interests of the Iberian Empire, by the end of the 18th century, Venezuela not only lacked a printing press, but did not have any of the intellectual societies that were fairly common in other cities of Spanish America, like in Buenos Aires or Lima or Bogota. The first printing press came to Caracas in 1808 with a clear goal, which was printing text to support the rights of Ferdinand VII because Spain was going through the Spanish monarchical crisis. The reason why the printing press came so late has been subject to very interesting debates. Some scholars argue that by the time Venezuela acquired some administrative or commercial importance because of the growing importation of cacao in the 1970s, the menace of a circulation of Enlightenment thinking in the Atlantic world triggered the Crown's concern about establishing a printing press in regions where they were particularly vulnerable to foreign presence or influence. With an open coast and huge coast facing the Caribbean, Venezuela was one of those colonies that needed to be receive closely vigilance from the Crown. The Crown was therefore able to restrict the function of the press in the province for decades. And I've seen several petitions in part of the elites to say, we really need a printing press. We would like to have a printing press so we can print texts that are, incumbent to our realities. They were always ignored. So for 20 years, these letters were ignored by the Crown. It was clear for everyone that the lack of the printing press responded merely to the motivations and concerns of the agents in the metropolitan Madrid, but not to the local population who were always asking for that permission. They were eager to produce and circulate their own texts. The lack of printing press, however, did not prevent Venezuelan public from exchanging ideas and participating in what I think is an incipient yet very dynamic public sphere during the intellectual agitated period of the Age of Revolutions. European travelers, for example, often note that Venezuela, of all social backgrounds, actively engaged in reading circles and networks of information sharing that kept them up to date about the political events in the Caribbean, in the United States and Europe. Moreover, between 1790 and 1800s, diverse political movements and popular rebellions echoing the calls of liberty and equality spread throughout the coastal region of Venezuela and exposed how Venezuelans from different social racial groups were well informed of the events of the revolutionary Atlantic. Okay. Yeah. Following Benedict Anderson's idea of, how crucial the printing press was as an instrument for the formation of political communities, many historians have insisted on the idea that low literacy rates and the presence of printing press in certain regions of colonial Latin America represented an important limitation for the transmission of knowledge and circulation of information among the population. These historians often assume a linear and straightforward relationship between local production of printing press and the emergence of collective spaces for political debate and the emergence of public sphere. The case of colonial Venezuela has been often at the center of these debates. Historian Jean-François Guerra, for example, questioned and criticized Anderson's idea that a national community began to be imagined in Venezuela at the end of the 18th century because he proved that there is no printing press. Guaira argues that during this period there were not local presses in Venezuela, therefore there were not possibilities for the development of political communities. For him, the emergence of early forms of public opinion in different colonial cities of the region took place a little later, between 1808 and 1814. And as a consequence of the crisis of the Napoleonic invasion in Spain. Guaira's main argument is that the Spanish crisis of 1808 was what really sparked a higher demand both in metropolis and the colonies for the information and subsequent proliferation of newspapers and public space for political debate. But even though if he's right, how do we explain, however, the development throughout the last decade of the 18th century of political conspiracies in Venezuela that continuously express calls for liberty, equality, and republicanism? How or why were foreign travelers impressed by the political awareness of different Venezuelan communities? Leaving aside the debate about if Venezuelans were not able to imagine, able to imagine themselves as a national community in late 18th century, it seems clear that despite the lack of printing press, Venezuelans were able to give shape to an incipient public sphere that was not grounded nor dependent on local newspapers or the printing press, but on original networks of circulation of text, reading circles, and semi-public debates that emerged in this colonial province. Intellectual and political historians who keep placing the printing press at the center of their analysis are at risk of becoming victims of the written and printed character of their historical sources, and perhaps unintentionally and neglecting the many other diverse and creative ways that people in the past, but also in the present, Facebook, Twitter, interact with different texts, creating new ways of producing knowledge and put information in circulation. In a recent article, historian Jorge Cañizares Guerra, for example, argues that early modern scientific knowledge was produced in the distant town of Potosí in the Andes, where people designed dams, aqueducts, tunnels, canals, and artificial lakes that gave shape to an incredible system for the extraction and transformation of silver. He says, print culture, the public sphere of academies, coffee shops, and aristocratic salons were not existent in Potosí. Yet, the production of scientific knowledge was possible. In the case of Venezuela, ephemeral texts, what I call newspapers, broadsides, pasquinades, papers, as the one that you saw, were perhaps the most important media of information for late colonial Venezuelans, who relied on mediators or semi-literate practices to access the written word. In a society with no printing press, and with limited access to books which were all imported from Spain, papeles sueltos, or loose papers, newspapers, broadsides, facilitated the exchange of ideas and information among underprivileged groups. Few members of the society, no more than 10% of the society, could read and write. Others could read but not write, and the large majority were non-literate. So in Venezuela, information was then regularly transported from one medium to the other in a way that written messages, letters, newspapers, pamphlets, and pasquinades were read aloud or even transformed into poems or songs, while oral messages were recorded in writing or represented in images. Thanks to their accessibility and ease of distribution, many of these ephemeral papers that were produced locally and were widely distributed were able to circumvent the control and censorship of both the state and the church. Those who were not afforded a formal education used these texts to participate in an emerging public sphere where they can share their opinions and where ideas of abolitionism, republicanism were debated and Spanish monarchy was openly criticized. From 1798 to 1808, hundreds of revolutionary texts from Europe and the Americas, in particular from France, Saint-Domingue, and Trinidad, appear in the coastal town of Venezuela. While these newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsheets horrify local officials and elites, they arouse the curiosity of common people who, regardless of race or education or status, did not hesitate to read them or to listen to their contents and put them in circulation. As soon as the news of rebellion of Saint-Domingue arrived on the shores of Venezuela in 1791, colonial officials redoubled their efforts at controlling the increasing influx of these papers and also people into Venezuelan shores. Local authorities devised strategies for monitoring ports, scrutinizing arriving passengers and their belongings, spying on foreign visitors and their neighbors, confiscating prohibited books and newspapers, and even forcing the local clergy to provide information about the readings of their congregants. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 only intensified this paranoia. In August 1793, members of the Council of Indies issued a royal decree to the governor of Venezuela, warning that, I quote, due to the current circumstances of war with France, dangerous books, papers, and news could enter our territories, jeopardizing the purity of our religion, public tranquility, and subordination. The council statement reflected the widespread idea that papeles sueltos, or loose papers, were quietly diffusing subversive ideas throughout the province and required increased vigilance on the part of the local officials. For months, authorities searched for these texts and debated about the extent or diffusion they had, and many of these texts mentioned in the colonial records could not be found in the archives because they were, of course, destroyed. But a few of these texts, however, have survived, and their contents allow us to explore a little bit of the kind of ideas that were circulating. So I have a list of some of the texts that I've been able to identify. There are basically foreign papers circulating in Venezuela. And although we don't have time to discuss all of this, I'll just comment on the ideas of a couple of them. So at the end of 1793, there's a Pardo soldier, his name is Jose Luis Aliado, who just came to the audiencia and brought a paper that was called Excerpt of the Manifiesto that the National Convention made for all the nations. It's the first paper that you see that it was created in 1790. The text, widely seen as the first anti-monarchical document to reach the mainland, summarized the arguments that the National Convention of Paris, as an institution that helped to foment the French Revolution, made against the monarchy. The document defended the Republic as the ideal system that opposed neither the belief in God nor the Catholic faith. The text discussed the need to spread revolution to the rest of Europe and the world, to eliminate the old corrupt and despotic monarchies because, I quote, kings are exquisite creations of human corruption. The document was locally distributed by a Navy captain and a port merchant. His name was Juan Javier Arrambide, who translated the document with the help of a Pardo pharmacist whose name was Tomás Cardoso. Captain General Carbonell did not have what to do with this paper or the people implicated in it. It's very interesting that although it was considered an extremely dangerous paper, he's not able to instruct or to give any punishment to these people because for him it was more important to keep this in secrecy to maintain the tranquility of the province. Rumors of the circulation of prohibited texts in Venezuela continued to swirl over the next 3 years. In May 1796, the audiencia met in order to discuss the circulation of another paper, a dangerous document entitled Instructions that Shall Serve as Rules for the French Interim Agent stationed in the Spanish side of the island of Santo Domingo. I think it's the fourth paper there. So this paper was written by Mr. Room de Saint Laurent, who was the French agent appointed to take control of Spanish Santo Domingo when Spain ceded Santo Domingo to France, and to organize the civil administration of the Spanish side of the island. According to Caracas Audiencia, the document contains several ideas capable, I quote, of causing harmful impressions among the simple people, especially the slaves, who in this province alone represent more than 100,000 souls. The document contained recommendations concerning the French occupation of Santo Domingo. It put forward a program of promoting love and respect for the Republic. It is important, I quote, above all, to make all the new citizens to love the Republic, to try to preserve all the precious population which belongs to this island. The author identified two principal enemies of the Republican cause: English invaders and royal Spaniards. Mr. Groom represented Spain as a reactionary nation that ignored the advantages of republicanism and lived without its glory. Contending that the Republican Constitution rejects the horrible system of slavery, the author strongly criticized the law and practices of the Spanish colonies. According to him, only people motivated by, I quote, vile interests could consider enslavement as the enslavement of a rational being as a colonial property right. The author insisted that once freedom is granted, ex-slaves will not abuse their liberty. On the contrary, they will be loyal. Only manumission could guarantee the tranquility of former slaves, preventing them from political discord. Members of the audiencia were particularly concerned about the circulation of this abolitionist manifesto and its potential effects on the common people of color, who they regarded as being simple-minded and not being able to kind of think by themselves. Although the paper was addressed to the French official of Santo Domingo, the audiencia thought, this paper could be very harmful in all the Americas because, I quote, anywhere it was read, it would be understood in the same way. On July 24, Venezuelan Captain General sent an order to the authorities in all over the provinces instructing them to confiscate this dangerous document. Several copies of the document were found in the city of Caracas, in the city of Valencia, in Coro, in a distant village of Obispos in the province of Barinas, in Cumaná. And although the governors managed to collect several copies of this document using the greatest discretion, because that's the tricky thing here. How do you find these papers without raising the interest and curiosity of the population, right? But they never discovered who had first put this paper into circulation, who read them, how many copies were made of the document. The governor of Trinidad, in particular, insisted that he was guarding against the sort of texts that came from the Caribbean, but the administration, he concluded, simply lacked the capacity to monitor the entire coast. Several officials' dispatches spoke to the need to sever all connections bridges between the islands and the mainland in order to disrupt the communication and prevent contagion. In a revealing document, the War Office Magistrate of Trinidad, José Damián de Cuenca, argued that any form of communication between Trinidad and the mainland Venezuela presented a serious threat. The island is close to those French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and its inhabitants are mostly French. The island, meaning Trinidad, does not have any forts nor enough troops. The number of foreign slaves is excessive, and Trinidad is clearly exposed to the fire of the revolution. In addition, he argued that if French insurgents were to take control of the island, they would assume a de facto control of eastern coast of Venezuela, in particular the Gulf of the Paria, and French Republican ideas would thus spread along the huge rivers of Orinoco, Guarapiche, El Tigre, and the infinitive numbers of streams. The contagion of rebellion will soon spread to the provinces of Cumaná, Guayana, Barinas, and as far as the kingdom of Nueva Granada. So he's like in a paranoid situation here where he even makes an analogy between the rivers and the veins of a body and revolution as a disease that could be contagious to the rest of the continent. Of course, my question as a historian was like, how were these texts first smuggled into the Spanish South American mainland? Records reveal that several circumstances facilitated the entrance of these materials into the coast. Foreigners also always brought books, gazettes, and papers to the coastal towns and cities and shared them with locals and private meetings and discussion groups. Records of denunciation made to the Inquisition reflects that commonly shared idea that foreigners were the ones who spread these subversive documents. When people were asked how they had come across a certain prohibited book or document, people in Caracas always said that it was a foreign visitor who brought it to his house. So Don Domingo Diaz, for example, admitted that he had several volumes of the history of revolution in his house, but it was basically a captain of an American ship who brought them in order to sell them to him. So now he was ready to return them, apparently. Doña Manuela Ibarra confessed that she had several prohibited books, but she explained that it was a gift for his nephew, who's a foreigner. He lives in Chile. Captain Don Juan Vicente Bolivar, who's the uncle of Simón Bolívar, confessed that he had La Julia, but it was not his. A foreigner lent it to me, and I have never returned it. So, of course, it was easier for these readers to blame an outsider than to accuse a family member or a friend or to confess that themselves they were the ones who acquired this text. But such excuses were often deemed credible, as the government was invested in this notion that foreigners were responsible for the sudden expansion of the revolutionary disease. In several of their confessions, readers mention that they read these private texts because they need to learn about the current events in the Atlantic world, in Europe, and the colonies, but that these readings never really perturbed their loyalty to the crown or their religious institutions. What really concerned colonial authorities then was that these readings could reach a larger audience and incite them to rebel. Venezuelan coast was wide open to the Caribbean Sea, and government agents found it extremely difficult to guard it against the entry of smugglers, as well as fugitives, maritime maroons, or the other subversive cartels who might carry prohibited books and papers with them. Many of the gazettes, newspapers, and pamphlets that entered in the mainland came from the nearby islands, especially from Trinidad, which was occupied by the British forces in 1797 and then ceded to the Spanish-English crown in 1802. Some months after the English occupation of Trinidad, Cumana's governor, Vicente Emparan, expressed his concerns to the Captain General about the smuggling activities, or the very intensive smuggling activities between English ships along the Venezuelan coast. He had heard that Spaniards from Trinidad were exchanging cattle and other livestock, leather goods, and tobacco with European goods. Emparan even mistruck his subalterns, who were never mentioned a word about this irregularity. And he expressed his frustration over the impossibility to control contraband and illegal commercial activities in his jurisdiction. He confessed, "For every door I close, 3 or 4 are opened." The circulation of contraband texts between Trinidad and the mainland continued throughout the first decade of the 19th century. In 1807, for example, a traveler visiting the city of Cumaná described the ubiquity of political sensitive documents. So look at this beautiful testimony. Okay. So it says, having one day entered the store of a grocer in the town of Cumaná, that's in Venezuela, I found him occupied in making paper bags and wrappers from the Declaration of the Rights of Man, copies of the social contract, and the bulls true or false of Pope Pius VI, which has communicated the French nation. I inquired how those papers had come to his shop. The following was his answer. I made a voyage to Trinidad after the Peace of Amiens, and the mister gave me a bale containing 500 copies of these writings, and as many by a Peruvian Jesuit who has long resided in London, by which he encouraged us to renounce our allegiance to our sovereign and promise the assistance of England. Such bales are given to all traders who frequent the ports of Trinidad. As for me, I took mine to the governor after reserved some copies to make bags. So these are, people eating fried fish from the bags made by with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Frequently, foreign merchants and local traders brought boxes of prohibited books, pamphlets, and leaflets and introduced them secretly into the Venezuelan mainland, where they always found curious listeners and avid readers. Venezuela, with its vast code, represented an easy target for Republican propagandism. So now, before we finish, I wanted to go through one conspiracy in particular that became very prominent and important in the coastal town of La Guaira. So you can see how these texts are being transformed into kind of a political movement. On July 13, 1797, the governor of Venezuela received the horrible news that there was a Republican movement evolving in the towns of Caracas and La Guaira. Rumors of the conspiracy traveled through very interesting channels. Manuel Montesinos was a merchant in Caracas and was a participant in the movement. He told his barber at the barber shop, Juan Jose Chirinos, who was also a Pardo soldier, that a group of people in Caracas and La Guaira were planning a Republican movement based on the principles of equality and liberty. Inviting his barber to join the movement, Montesinos provided Chirinos with a copy of a Republican song, El Soneto Americano, and encouraged him to copy it and pass it along others who might join the movement. According to the investigators of the movement, the main goals of this Republican conspiracy included the establishment of free trade, the abolition of slavery with compensation to slave owners, the elimination of the Indian tributes, the abolition of taxes, all kinds of taxes, estanco, which was the tax imposed into tobacco sales, other taxes imposed into foodstuff and commercial alcabalas. The movement also sought to foster harmony among the races. White, Pardos, Indians, and blacks were seen as brothers in Jesus Christ. Through the main leaders, although the main leaders, Manuel Gual and Jose Maria España, were both white Creoles, meaning they were white with a Spanish origin, but they were born in Venezuela. They obtained remarkable support from a group of pardos and people of color, poor whites, small merchants, royal officials, soldiers, and artisans in the town of La Guaira and Caracas. These are... All of these actors participated in a complex networks of information through which ideas of revolution, equality, liberty, and republican principles were spread. Analyzing these networks and the kind of text that collaborators produce allow us to understand the importance that performativity had in the process of production and spreading of information and political opinions that gave shape to this anti-colonial movement. Official records of the inquiry reveal that the insurgents of La Guaira produced a considerable number of written texts designed to instruct their followers in the republican principles of the movement. Among these texts, there were local texts such as proclamations, insurrections, poems, stories, letters, songs, as well as translation and adaptations of foreign texts like the Declaration of Rights of Man and other kind of a revolutionary texts from Spain, France, and Saint-Domingue. The local texts produced in La Guaira provide a helpful vantage point for analyzing the insurgents' diverse strategies for imparting political knowledge and galvanizing their supporters, the kind of narratives and discourses they used to call the attention of colonial subjects, and how they devised the political outcomes of this movement. Despite the evident social-racial tensions that existed between whites and people of color in colonial Venezuela, the Conspiracy of La Guaira was particularly successful in creating a socially diverse group of people who together created this network of production and distribution of texts. So in this group, there were white Creole port officials who were found to be collecting foreign papers and books in the port. There was another group of white Creoles who shared their books and their libraries with a larger group of readers and listeners. They transcribed some extracts from these books and organized dinners and walks to talk about the Atlantic and local politics. There was a French barber and a mestizo pharmacist who were translating some of the French texts into Spanish and circulating their transcription. There was a Spanish prisoner who was a prisoner in La Guaira, Juan Bautista Picornell, who was being accused of organizing a conspiracy, the Conspiracy of San Blas in Madrid, and he was held in La Guaira. He helped the conspirators write in some political stories, dialogues, and political catechisms to be read aloud to potential contributors. There's a mixed-race Pardo militiaman coordinating meetings to share the news. There was a man who owned a barbershop. He was a Pardo barber who owned a barbershop and used the barbershop as a workshop, as a place to go and talk about politics. Authorities discovered that the barbershop of the mixed-race Pardo, Narciso del Valle, and I'm sorry, I don't have an image of him because he was pretty much forgotten from the conspiracy. Authorities discovered that the barbershop of the mixed-race Pardo, Narciso del Valle, located in the port of La Guaira and across the street from the Pardo militia barracks, served as the central place where organizers met to produce, reproduce, and diffuse these texts that Picornell and others had written to recruit people into the movement. The barbershop, the military barracks, and the private houses of collaborators, readers, and listeners get together, transpose texts from one medium to the other, the written messages, letters, newspapers that were read aloud to others who didn't know how to read. There were texts that were transformed into poems and songs, while oral messages and stories were recorded in writing, passed along in pieces of papers. The texts written by the collaborators of the movement and spread at the barbershop aim at creating awareness of how the crown have oppressed their vassals, insisted in the idea of responsibly defending the American fatherland, the Patria Americana, and legitimated the idea of rebellion as a resource to establish a revolutionary equality and fraternity within the Christian love for others and divine justice. So this is a movement that is not anti-church, it's not anti-Catholic, it's the opposite. They believe that Catholicism is providing the base to declare equality, which is kind of very interesting, and it's a twist from the French Revolution. The text that circulated in La Guaira, and this is the town of La Guaira in 1806, I forgot I had this. These are the texts, some of them. These texts were written using distinctive narratives. There are fictional biographies, there are letters, short stories, and dialogues that seemed necessary to attract the mixed-race population of La Guaira and Caracas. Therefore, these texts were written in a style and discourse appropriate to be read aloud, using familiar narrative formulas easy enough to be digested, memorized, and to be retold orally. One text entitled Letter from a Grandfather to His Grandchild, I think I have it there, number 3, offers an imaginary letter from a grandfather in Cadiz, in Spain, to his grandchild who lives across the Atlantic in America. The old man described the difficulty of living in Spain, where, I quote, a bad government oppresses the poor people, and where agriculture, commerce, and the arts are devastated by the tyranny of the king. He comments that America, too, have experienced oppression and misery, but that he has heard that a new political movement will soon liberate them. With this text, the author sought to foster a sense of empathy between Peninsular and American Spaniards, both of whom are depicted as victims of the monarchical system. He optimistically placed his hopes of change in the Spanish-American colonies, inviting Americans to be protagonists of their own political destiny. It is interesting to know that these manuscripts produced and spread in La Guaira provided readers and listeners with something no other foreign revolutionary text had offered before, an intimate awareness of their own reality. With no printing presses, people in Venezuela frequently complain about the seeming irrelevance of peninsular books, French treatises, or Caribbean proclamations to their geopolitical situation. But the writings of La Guaira seem to have ended these representation problems, speaking directly to their local concerns. Insurgents of La Guaira created texts that sought to adapt Republican ideas to local social and economic circumstances, and through innovative narrative strategies made them accessible to a semi-literate population of color. In this context, the La Guaira movement's social networks developed around multimedia sources of information that were crucial to the formation of this emerging public sphere. So just to conclude, in the colonial reality of Venezuela, the effective circulation of the written word and the subsequent emergence of a public sphere did not depend on printing presses and local newspapers. As discussed here, although the Crown never authorized the establishment of press, book newspapers, booklets, and pamphlets found their way to Venezuela, and colonial commercial networks that existed between Spain and Venezuela privileged the domination of Spanish books and newspapers, and that found new uses in colonial war. The lack of presses probably encouraged a very dynamic practice of book sharing and lending, text transcriptions and manuscript production that ended transforming the books and newspapers, foreign books and newspapers, in new different texts, but that also entailed the expansion of social expansion, the social expansion of reading, discussion, and debate. Venezuelans seem aware that in order to keep themselves up to date in the literate world and current information, they needed to rely on social networks, friends, classmates, neighbors, and family members. These diffuse networks of readers and listeners did not depend on the colonial state or institutions. In fact, they actually escaped their control. Colonial subjects were also able to introduce many foreign and prohibited books, newspapers, and pamphlets that suffered the same fate of the Spanish books as they were transcribed and in many cases assembled with other texts. It was clear then that in late colonial Venezuela, the written word often circulated in manuscript forms that many times passed unnoticed to colonial authorities and church representatives. All the printed materials circulating in the region were produced abroad, but colonial readers and writers transcribed and translated many of these, contextualized them, and gave them new meanings for local consumption, creating a fertile ground for political debates and action locally. Those who were not afforded formal education or did not have the means to buy expensive books read and use these texts to participate in an emerging sphere of public opinion where ideas about abolitionism and republicanism were debated and the Spanish monarchy was openly criticized. These networks of circulation of texts might have been, then, the first steps that Venezuelans took to create social spaces where autonomous individuals discuss matters of common interest while successfully evading the control of colonial institutions. This public sphere that escaped the control of elites and colonial authorities was built not upon printing shops or local newspapers controlled by highly educated white Creoles, but upon effective circuits of reading and sharing manuscripts, stories, and songs among socially diverse participants arranged in their own social networks of internet information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. If you're interested in asking a question, we ask you, as we usually do, please come to the microphone so that everyone can hear your question as well as the response. Please just tell us your name, what you're studying, and then your question. And we know about 10 to a number of you will have to leave. If you need to do so, we're still going. Please just do so quietly. So, please.
Hi, my name is Kenny Ahlstrom. I'm studying public health at BYU. And my question is, what do you think the biggest takeaway can be for us as BYU students or citizens of the United States from this experience of Venezuela and everything that you've studied?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, I mean, the most interesting part of doing this work is, first of all, as historians, we tend to be, as I said at the beginning, kind of a victims of the literary world because we're readers and writers, and most of our documents are written documents. And that's what kind of legitimizes the work that we do. And we often forget that, humans are not reading and writing all the time. There are other forms that we communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. And that's why, in a way, my work is inviting people to look at other forms of media and information sharing that we use in society, even today. Because, and sometimes, I feel kind of bad for the historians of the future who's going to try to find Twitter and Facebook to try to understand the political reality of, 2018, right? How are they going to be able to reach those sources? That's one of the questions that I ask myself. But I do think that, politics is not something that's only attached to one group in particular. This is showing that everyone is interested, invested in being a political participant. So in a way, it's an invitation to really, I think the process that's going on in Venezuela is an early process of democratization of knowledge, and in particular of political information. So that's what I think I'm taking from this, and I hope you can take too.
Awesome, thank you.
My name is Diana, and I'm studying international relations and a minor in linguistics. Mm-hmm. And I actually had a question. So I am working on research for kind of like the political culture found in South America through the use of dialects. Mm-hmm. And my question is, so they don't have written languages and stuff, and my own grandparents speak a lot of these dialects. So how did you go about finding those songs and those poems without having, because I've looked into many libraries, mm-hmm. and I simply can't find much information in Quechua or Aymara or any of those languages.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think for me it was the most important challenge of this work for many reasons. In one hand, the state, in this case the colonial state, they're trying to keep this in secrecy, right? They don't want to talk about this. So all the time, in the sources you can see that things are not very evident. So at some point, even before looking into rebellions, I was trying to understand, how kind of a media developed, this multimedia world developed in Venezuela. And I found out that the only way to look at that was through the rebellion, because rebellions are these very important historical moments where things come to the fore. Mm-hmm. And although these colonial agents are not willing to talk about rebellion or resistance or how are these kind of a parallel wars developing, the reality is so there that they cannot avoid it. So there's always, for me, it was about understanding that I wouldn't never find a source telling me this is what they think, but the state always indirectly will talk about who are implied, in this case, in this rebellion, and what is entitled there. Mm-hmm. So in your case, there have been historians who've been using oral history, and that's always tricky because it depends on the time span that you're using. Using oral history for research that's 500 years ago is very difficult. But if you use oral history as a cultural guide to understand what kind of concepts are still living in that area, and you can always compare oral history with written resources, then you can find a match. So that I would say that would be one possibility. But of course, in your case, what I think is important here is to recognize that even if they're not speaking Spanish, so they're speaking Aymara or Quechua, they're still active participants of their societies and are doing politics. And in a way, the use of their language is also a form of political resistance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is John Larson. My major is undeclared. My question is, do you think there is a most effective means of communication? And if so, what is it?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think in the case, I'm trying to think about these people in the past trying to get in contact with each other. I think community building. For them, it's about creating bridges between different groups and making sure that they have a common ground or common cause. The conspiracy of Guaira is a particular interesting case because it's putting together people who were, usually seen as separate. They're, white Creole people or merchants who are very rich, who are sitting on the table with Pardo artisans and even with slaves coming from a nearby town. And they found a moment to sit down and work together because they thought they had a common cause. So in their case, I think it has to do with community building and each community establishing which are the most effective means for them to stay together. In these cases, I've seen that they're all the time doing things together, like finding the ground to have that commonality. And but I'm a serious user of Twitter right now, so I do look into Twitter. However, I'm trying to be also a responsible citizen, and if I see a news that sounds weird, I check it several times with different media. So that's one of the things that I kind of recommend people to check your sources several times. And the same way historians are critical to primary sources in the past, we should be today critical of the sources that we use to be informed. So yeah, that's kind of a present day recommendation. Yeah.
Hola.
Hola.
My name is Matt Hill. I'm the Latin American and Iberian Area Studies librarian. And so books are my jam, so to speak. I also do work in book history, specifically in the colonial period in Mexico and the Philippines.
Ah, great.
And so I'm wondering if you could address the question of how you see your book and your research generally in Venezuela and print culture as contributing to the larger field of print studies in marginal areas of the empire, speaking in terms of the press and print culture.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's a great question. In fact, my undergrad thesis was on private libraries in Caracas. So I collected it was 100 library inventories of private libraries I was able to collect, and then I ended up producing a database of 2,500 kind of titles that were circulating in Caracas. And so all the time I was using this, I was just looking at the white elites because they were the only ones who had the money to buy books. If there's a country with no printing press, books are very expensive because they're coming from Spain or other. Mexico and Spain will be the two places where books are coming. So no one really had money to buy books. And so, of course, my question was so if they're reading these books and this is what they have, that doesn't mean that they're the only ones reading, right? So in my case, I kind of follow Roger Chartier with the idea of, doing the history of reading is kind of gives you kind of a more complete vision than just doing the history of books. So I think I move in that kind of a direction of saying, instead of doing history of books, I want to do history of reading. And then I discovered that people were reading much more than Reinald or Rousseau. And I think, one of the arguments that I make in this book is that these pamphlets and broadsides were way more popular and significant than Rousseau and Reinald. And still, they're participating in a kind of a revolutionary share of information. So it's still, but they're not reading the original kind of a European thinker. So in a way, it's also a movement that walks away from Eurocentrism in the ways of how we think revolutionary ideas, created in the Caribbean. So I do put the Haitian Revolution as a more crucial revolutionary event than the French Revolution or even the American Revolution. I have found that people had the Constitution of the United States in Caracas, and they called it the Tratado de Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Treaty, but it's basically the Constitution of the United States. And people circulated that, and there's also Common Sense is popular in Caracas, but it's not as popular as this, just because of the amounts of papers that the state is collecting. This Caribbean paper seems to be more important. And then the local ones that they produced, for example, the Conspiracy of La Guaira, became even more important because they're just transcribing them. The thing is that, of course, it takes time to transcribe documents, and these are mostly manuscripts. So I'm also inviting historians to look into manuscripts. I know it's hard to find them, but it's also, it's a very effective way of communication that's still being used even though there's a printing press. So I have been in conferences where people ask me, so Cristina, if I'm doing the history of revolutionary ideas in Lima and there's a printing press, my work is inviting them to go beyond the printing press and see what other kind of texts are circulating in a manuscript form.
Can I ask a follow-up? Or should I let Darren ask a question?
I don't know.
I'll ask a follow-up later.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Darren.
That's all right. Hi. I'm Darren Hawkins. I teach political science here at BYU. A fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really interesting. I would like, if you can, I would like to hear a little bit more about the push side, maybe, right? I mean, who is, you talked a lot about the Venezuela side, but are there people in France or in the United States who are hoping to push these kinds of texts to Venezuela, who are hoping to incite some kind of revolution? And could I hear a little bit more about those folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I have found is that mostly French visitors or foreigners and also British people living in Trinidad once Trinidad was occupied were interested in bringing this text. I have asked myself several times about the American kind of an intervention or presence, and to be honest, it's not very strong during this time because I think they had their plate full with building a nation. So I think their influence is more important later in the 1820s and 1825, but still during the Independence War, the Americans are always, wearing the neutral flag. They don't want to get into the war because they're, trying to build their own military troops, so they're not ready to get there. I would say that the French and the British are more into kind of fomenting these ideas in Latin America. I didn't talk about this here, but there's a whole chapter which is about rumors and the presence of foreigners in Venezuela. And there's at some point in 1994 that there are 1,000 French prisoners, visitors, soldiers, refugees living in La Guaira. And La Guaira is a town of only 7,000 people. So if you take that in consideration, 7,000 people and 1,000 foreigners, their presence was unavoidable. And they were speaking about the French Revolution all the time. So that was part of, and they were there right before. They left 2 months before this movement was discovered. So of course, their influence is evident there. And even though there are even French royalists who are, defending the monarchy, just the fact that they bring information is dangerous. That's the state. That's what the state believes. Like, we need to get rid of them. It doesn't matter what political position they have. Once they're here, they're talking about the reality that we don't want them to talk about. So their presence is there, and they have very strong connections with the white elites. They do have a difficult situation with some other groups because the state have been very effective in expanding a sense of kind of a Francophobia, like everything that's French is bad. So generally speaking, there were cases in which they were expelled from taverns or pubs because they were French. So they have to deal with that, like, this sort of Francophobia that's been fomented by or encouraged by the state. But yeah, their presence is unavoidable, especially during these times. Yeah, thanks.
Just really quickly, I'm Ana Lopez. I'm from Paraguay. I'm studying economics here. And my question just went kind of along the lines of what he said, where were these pressures coming from? Because we see all these revolutionary movements in North America and South America, like even in Paraguay, from what I know. So the environment was really different because, as you said, people didn't read or people didn't write. So I just wanted to know any insights that you got on how all those ideas spread.
Well, I think in the case of Venezuela, it's pretty clear that the location is just privilege. I always said that Venezuela, in my opinion, is at the center of the Atlantic revolutions. It was so easy to just get there. And then the Haitian Revolution, of course, kind of called a lot of attention. It was the anti-model, and everyone was scared of having more Haitian revolutions in the rest of America. And there's this continuous discourse that Venezuela and New Granada were the gates of the South American continent. So the Crown put more effort in controlling those regions than in other places, but still it was impossible. The influx was there. And there's a lot of people from Santo Domingo refugees moving to Venezuela once Santo Domingo was ceded to Saint-Domingue. And then Toussaint Louverture, who's one of the most important leaders of the Haitian Revolution, invaded Santo Domingo in 1801. And that meant that hundreds of Santo Domingo refugees moved to Venezuela. And again, they're bringing ideas of what's going on in Santo Domingo. So I think the geographical situation kind of played in favor for this kind of political dynamic and kind of a intense environment that developed in Venezuela. I have gotten the question of why, if 1790, 1800s, there's a lot of kind of a conspiracies, there's a huge slave rebellion that developed in one of the coastal areas, how come independence doesn't come but much later in 1811 and then 1821? And one interesting thing is that the Crown was so concerned with Venezuela that they finally decided to send a new Captain General in the 1800s. His name was Guaira Vasconcelos, and he came in with the idea of developing a peaceful agenda. And he encouraged, and this is like the last part of my book, he encouraged white masters and white people to be more open and to reconcile with the people of color. And he even demanded, for example, eliminated some taxes that were very difficult for indigenous groups and especially free black people of color. He encouraged masters to kind of moderate their punishments. So there is a period where there is a sense of the state being more friendly, open, and less harsh into people of color in order to prevent more rebellions or conspiracies. So that explains that kind of a 10 years of peacefulness or tense calmness before the revolution really erupted in the 1810s, 1811.
Thank you. I'm definitely gonna read your book then.
Thank you.